Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Sui Generis. My name is Isaac Christopher Lubogo, and today I'm privileged and honored to host a distinguished gentleman, a man of no mean repute, a man who has established himself in public service, a former DC, former Undersecretary in the President's office, and quite a number of other things that he has done, but also a lecturer. He's been lecturing at MOOCs, so I can comfortably call him Professor Richard Kaira. Professor Richard Kaira has distinguished himself in public administration and the like. So today we're going to discuss a few things of constitutionalism in terms of democracy, what democracy would mean in terms of an African context, but what is the origin of democracy and the things like that. You can introduce yourself, my brother and professor.
My name is Richard Lubogo. I'm a lecturer and consultant in various areas, especially in public administration, in organizational analysis, and in leadership. I've been working in various institutions and in government departments.
Yes, now I would comfortably request you to speak a little bit more audible because our viewers would like to hear you. Our discussion today has everything to do with democracy. I would like to argue and say that we want to first of all conceptualize the meaning of democracy. I'll do the preamble and then you can, juxtapose in with a number of arguments in terms of what you comprehend in terms of democracy. I would argue and say that democracy started in Athens as far as the best records can reflect. Athens in Greece, and the understanding of democracy was a fair or equitable representation of what people would mean in terms of the amenities, in terms of the services that they would want. And then it took on another trend. From Greece, we see it being co-opted by philosophers like John Locke, philosophers like Montesquieu, philosophers like Rousseau. And particularly when you look at John Locke's dispensation of the argument of democracy, he makes a dispensation of democracy to mean that democracy would mean the amenities or the issues that have to do with the rights of individuals. And if whatever powers that be, if these rights are not met, then people are obligated to revolt against these so-called big powers. When you argue people like Montesquieu, on the other hand, Montesquieu brings in the argument of the three arms of government, the separation of powers. We see for the first time the separation of powers in terms of the legislature, the judiciary, and then the argument of the parliament. You know, the legislature just say in terms of parliament, judiciary, and then the executive. The three arms of government. Professor Kanyama says it's like three cooking pots carrying a pot. Three stones having a pot in between and making a good meal. What is your contemplation of that?
Yeah, let's first go back to the word democracy. Democracy is a Greek word.
Yes.
There are two words from the word democracy. There's demo. Demo means people.
Yes.
And krase means rule. So democracy essentially is a rule by the people.
Okay.
As you rightly said, democracy started basically in the city-states, in the Greek city-states. It was easily applicable there in those Greek city-states because these were small communities which could easily allow participation of the people in decision-making in government.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
So basically, historically, that's where democracy came from. Later on, rightly, we have been discussing those various philosophers like John Locke, like Montesquieu.
Yes, more audibility. Yes.
Who came up with various views regarding democracy. Well, democracy has been changing due to the nature of the environment. But let's look at Abraham Lincoln. How does he describe democracy?
Okay, before we go to Abraham Lincoln, in terms of the gritty address that he made, we would like to trace democracy in terms of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta of 1215 comes in with the semblance of democracy, where now for the first time we're seeing the challenge of the powers of these monarchs, if you like.
Of the monarchs.
Of the monarchs. And they're saying now, listen, we are now checking your powers. We're saying you are not the, the alpha and omega in terms of what you say. But for the first time, we are seeing a semblance of a check in terms of the powers, limiting the powers of these individuals. I would also want to argue in terms of, if I'm to Africanize the kind of democracy we're talking about before we go to Abraham Lincoln, in terms of bringing in the aspect of government by the people, for the people, and in terms of the argument, those three elements that you said, government by the people, for the people, and for the people. Before we bring in that contextualization of what Abraham Lincoln brings in, I would also want to argue what Professor Makandula says, that these kind of democracies have also been existent in Africa for some time, and they have taken a different trend. Only that the kind of democracies that we have in Africa were institutionalized in terms of substantive monarchical systems, where he argues and says kings, for example, or monarchs, for example, African monarchs, were argued to be stationary bandits or revolution, or stationary bandits or revolving bandits. In fact, he argues and says kings are argued in terms of what they call revolving bandits, and then stationary bandits. These are a group of individuals who are sub-powers, maybe because of what? Of bulldozing or overcoming certain individuals, and then they ended up passing the torch of power to their next of kin or to their children. And that, so we see a development of kind in terms of royal birthrights, if you like. And that is one of the books that we also came about in terms of demystifying the aspect of royal birthright. But then you are bringing the aspect of Abraham Lincoln in terms of the government by the people, for the people, in terms of those three elements. Please go ahead.
But let's go back to what you were talking about Africa.
Yes.
In relation to democracy, is that the argument is that in Africa there was feudalism, more or less.
Yes.
And we say feudalism is against democracy. Because feudalism ensures centralization of power in monarchy. Whereas democracy is more or less decentralization of power to the people.
Okay.
So feudalism in Africa was an impediment in the development of the democratic process there. And even currently, where you have, although currently then in modern times, feudalism has been narrowed down by economic and social factors. But we are arguing that there was an element of democracy in another form in Africa. And what was that? When you look at Africa, where there were no, in situations where there were no strong feudal states, you find that powers were given to various councils. And in this case, powers were given to elders. So democracy in Africa was based on age.
Okay.
Those who have age then had the powers to make the decisions.
Okay.
So democracy was not based on functional positions, but it was based on seniority.
So are you arguing that democracy could mean different contextualization in different arenas?
So in the African context, because the African didn't believe that African societies were democratic. In the African context then, because you can argue that there are various contexts regarding democracy. But in the African context, that when you give power to the elder, then you have democracy. Whereas in the case of the European or Western countries, is that when you vote for somebody and power, where the majority makes a decision, then that's democracy.
Okay.
So therefore, the issue of majority and minority in Africa didn't apply.
I see. So when you argue in terms of the importation or the exportation of democracy, where would you find yourself? Are you trying to say that Africa exported democracy to Europe, or Europe has exported democracy to Africa?
I think we have different breeds of democracy. That's what I'm saying. Like in here at one time, I think that we should develop African socialism. At the same time, we should also develop African democracy. There's those kind of arguments. A hybrid democracy which is suitable to African situation in terms of social and economic situations, even political situations. So it should not be what we call liberal democracy. A democracy which is based on Western ideas, on Western culture, and on Western values.
When you argue liberal democracy, I would like you to make a dispensation for me, or a discussion for me, in terms of Fukuyama. His argument of Fukuyama at the end of history.
Fukuyama
Yes.
wrote a book about linear progression of political systems.
Yes.
And Fukuyama was arguing that in the end, the world will be having liberal and democratic systems.
Okay.
Whereas, which was totally against the Marxist approach.
And what was the Marxist approach?
The Marxist approach was what we call the last stage. I call the Marxist. The last stage of the bomb is where you have communism. Marxism was arguing that capitalism and democracy would be overthrown by communism. And at the end of the world,
Yes.
will be communistic. Whereas Fukuyama is arguing, given the scenarios of the fall of Soviet Union, that the world will adopt liberal democracy. Although that has not happened.
So, I remember one time, I think it was the French president who made a call to some West African country, and he was asking for certain amenities to be done in their country. And the president of Africa replied and said, listen, Your Excellency, we have a democracy. And said, do not tell me about democracy in Africa. Democracy in Africa is a fallacy. Would you want to argue, Professor, that democracy in Africa is a fallacy?
I think Africa is facing many challenges to adapt to what I call ideal democracy. Because when you look at ideal democracy, you find that even in Western Europe and America, to really adopt ideal democracy is hard, given the conditions in Africa.
Yes.
So I still believe that Africa has many challenges to be able to adapt what we call ideal democracy. Those factors are Kaira well known, but basically we can say that in Africa, given the democratic process, in Africa is facing many difficulties, especially regarding government in power, which more or less dilute the process of democratization.
So do we have parameters? Do we have set benchmarks that would determine what is a democracy in any state of this world?
I think one word describes democracy is participation in decision making.
And by participation, who is participating?
The people should participate.
So you are going back to the argument of government by the people, for the people, in terms of...
those are the universal accepted principles of democracy.
Now, the question I would also want to pose in terms of that contextualization, if that is the true interpretation of democracy, then why are we seeing governments that have been elected into office? Yes, I'll give an example of sub-Saharan countries in West Africa, Chad, for example, yeah. Others that have had a number of countries in West Africa, Niger, Syria, you know, and the like, Burkina Faso, for example, particularly those countries, we have elections, and at the end of the day, these governments are toppled, and there's an overwhelming majority that seems to be saying now, this is democracy.
Yes.
So where is the benchmark?
I think the major failures in those countries is that although artificially they were trying to apply democracy through
the ballot.
Yes.
Yes.
But you see, when these governments were elected in power, then the expectations of the people were not achieved. And therefore,
Even before they are tested? Professor, even before they are tested?
Some of these leaders had been tested and they had been in power for quite some time. Like in Gabon,
Yes.
then I think Bongo's father had been a president.
Yes.
And also the son became a president.
Okay. Let's give it a benefit of doubt. Let's just assume that these powers are untested. How about in countries, for example, where we are seeing substantive democracies, quotes that have taken place? I'll give an example of former Iraq during the times of Saddam Hussein. I'll give another example of Libya during the times of Gaddafi. I'll give another example of which other country. Even Syria had been attempted.
But those countries were not democratic.
So you are
according to realistic
so who sets the yardstick?
Democracy.
Who sets the yardstick? That's the question.
I think we can say that democracy has basic, acceptable.
And what are those basics, Professor? Let's be realistic. If you're saying they were not accepted and the people overwhelmingly voted for them, recently Rwanda has got 99%. Who sets the yardstick? You are saying democracy would mean people, rule of law. Not so. That is true interpretation. And we are arguing that
ruled by the majority.
Ruled by the majority. And the majority through the ballot.
Through the ballot.
So the ballot have decided that saying we have overwhelmingly voted these people. And we are now saying they were not representative of the people. And they are overthrown. The Western powers come, they overthrow them, they create a system that fails to take base. So what is democracy? What is the truth? Aren't we changing goalposts in terms of what would really mean in terms of the true interpretation of the law? Don't you believe that democracy means different things in different continents?
There's an argument that various political systems believe democracy in different ways. I'll give an example.
Yes.
Is that communism, or the communists, especially during the Soviet era, believed that Soviet Union was a democracy. Because they are looking at democracy in terms of reducing inequality, especially economic inequality. They believe that democracy was about having more or less equal opportunities regarding jobs, regarding health, regarding education. So they argue that Western countries were actually very undemocratic because there was inequality and there were no opportunities then for various services. So they argue that, for example, North Korea calls itself democratic.
Absolutely.
Democratic. North Korea. But everybody is arguing that North Korea is a communist country and it's not democratic.
So don't you think that the definition of democracy is subjective to certain individuals of certain powers at play? Because even in America, for example, who calls themselves the police of the world in terms of advocating for democracy, we've seen, especially remember the time when Trump had left office, you remember? The revolutions and the revolts that took place, you know? We've seen several attempts on different individuals in America. What is the yardstick of the true interpretation of democracy? That is where I'm failing to understand. We all understand that there should be basics that define perhaps the rule of law, like you rightly say, the human rights, like you rightly say. Those are, especially the non-derogable. Those are the ones that are protected by the Magna Carta. But can we argue that we could also understand democracy to mean different things in different contexts because of the different manifestations of these countries that end up being played out?
So the argument is that democracy give a different cultural and economic and political diversity should have different interpretations. Others give you that example. In case of the communist countries, they do that democracy. In the case of now, Iran,
Yes,
Iran is now having what we call a theocracy.
absolutely.
Based on it's a political system
Based on religion.
which is based on religion.
Yes.
But Iran claims to be a democratic country from a religious point of view.
Right.
So therefore, what I'm saying that the way we look at democracy could differ given different cultures, given different economic and political systems.
Absolutely. And I think there I agree with you, Professor. I would also want to argue that sometimes these democracies end up translating themselves in what they call hybrid syndrome, which hybrid syndrome end up leading what they call nemesis. And hybrid syndrome, by the semblance of this idea of overstaying in power, for example, or perhaps too much power, absolute power leads to absolute corruption eventually. So I would want to argue, in terms of contextualizing the argument of democracy, that democracy would reflect differently, perhaps in different institutions. It's like a father governing a home. He chooses to have certain amenities. There are basic things probably he has to provide for his family, but he may say, my room is this way, or I choose to let my visitors stay here, or I choose to have meal X on day Y. In terms of different dispensations, in terms of his management, rather than having a blanket argument of democracy. Maybe that's what has led to a defeat of the true reflection of true interpretation of what we call a democracy. I would give an example of what is happening in Kenya recently. We all know what's happening in Kenya. President Ruto comes up and says, you know what, we're not interested in the finance bill. He says, okay, I'm settling, I'm not assenting to it, I'm getting it off the head. And the GZ generation agree, not so.
Yeah.
And then what happens the next day? They say, now we want you out of office. He has put his foot on the ground and said, wait a minute, Kenya is a democracy. I think enough is enough. Don't you see that now we are misunderstanding the argument of democracy? For us to truly have a true reflection of the true interpretation of what democracy is, I think we are now diverting and moving away from the basics that were created by the Magna Carta, by philosophers, Montesquieu, by people like you rightly say, the American president, Abraham Lincoln and the likes, are now adapting amenities that suit our purpose in terms of underscoring what a true democracy is. I would like you to say something in conclusion, Professor Pab.
Yeah, because I'm saying that democracy is, what they call a deep democracy, as I've been saying, is very hard to achieve. Even the United States is not a true democracy.
Yes.
From political, economic, and social aspect. And therefore, we should not be pursuing hard to achieve in reality democracy, because in reality, especially in African context, in African conditions, democracy cannot be achieved due to so many other factors which impede democracy. Another way of looking at democracy is that because people are reality democracy is the best system. But I look at that argument in that having the majority, does it mean that when you are in the majority, you are right? When you are making a decision and you are in the majority, does it mean you are right?
Is majority right?
Is the majority right?
Absolutely, that's a good question.
Because we are finding that there are situations where the
Majority might actually be right.
be right.
Or perhaps my minority may assume a majority another day.
Yes.
So should we change the temperament and say at time X, democracy, because the majority was right at that point, that's what
That's
the
why
reflection of democracy.
Yeah, that's why it could happen that at that time they thought they are right, but eventually they find that they are wrong, and
yes.
they don't know how to get rid of those governments.
Absolutely.
So what they do,
You accept them.
they use the military,
And probably
they
that's
use the military to overthrow those governments.
and that's what brings in the Kelsen theory. The Kelsen theory in terms of interpreting. If a legal norm or a legal order is successfully overthrown and the majority accept it, then it becomes the new norm.
Well,
and therefore it now becomes legal.
If you go to Burkina Faso, if you look at Burkina Faso, what happened? There was celebration.
Right.
Even in Gabon, when this government were overthrown. But then these are the governments which were being elected democratically.
I
So
know.
what happened?
Absolutely. I mean, the semblance of the time.
So
when-
the majority were thought they were right at that time of voting, but afterwards they found that it was a wrong choice.
So, other than the true basics of human rights that you're saying that cannot be tampered with, we could argue and say that perhaps, like the Latin phrase "vox populi," vox Dei, the voice of people, become the voice of God, and solus populi lex externa, meaning that the welfare of the people becomes supreme. Perhaps fundamentally, my argument would be in my dispensation that even as we struggle to so much define this word democracy, we should understand it in the contextualization of the affairs that are governing the nation that we are living in at that particular time. What would you say in conclusion, Professor Kaira?
Because I'm saying that there's one dimension we should look at
Yes.
regarding the process of democracy. Is that democracy is a choice. But how do we make choices? It goes back to the majority. How do majority make choices? Is that if you are going to make a good choice, you must be knowledgeable about the various options regarding the choices. But are other people knowledgeable about, for example, about the manifestos of the various parties to make the right choices? You find that a lot of people are not conversant with the manifestos of various political parties. And they make wrong choices. So democracy is about knowledge.
It's about knowledge rather than populism.
Than populism.
And that's the reason why sometimes people...
And also ethnicity.
And ethnicity, tribalism and the likes, sentiments and nepotism and the like. That's why sometimes you find that you have to make a distinction in terms of what they call truly inspired and demagogues, or what they call demagoguery. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, my name is Christopher Lubogo. I've been hosting a wonderful gentleman here, Professor Kaira, a man who has established himself in administrative matters in this country and beyond, a graduate from some of the best alma maters in England, and a senior citizen of this country, and also a reputable lecturer in a number of institutions in this country. And God bless you. Greetings from Sui Generis. Find many of our books at lubogo.org and suigenerislawapp.com. Thank you.